Well, welcome to the 32nd episode of Ideas and Lives, or as my colleague Tzvi Bodhi and friend Tzvi Bodhi likes to say, the Bob and Tzvi Show. And I'm a social policy economist, and Tzvi's a financial economist. Tzvi, hello. How you doing today?
I have to come clean at the very beginning and say that Eytan was my mentor. And
well, first, they don't even know who we're interviewing yet.
Oh, all right. Why don't you introduce him?
We're interviewing today Eytan Sheshinski, the Dean of Economics in Israel, and a big influence on the lives of both Tzvi and me. So Tzvi, you tell your story first, and then I'll tell mine.
Yeah, well, my story is that Eytan, way back in 1968, after the Six-Day War, was my mentor when I did my master's thesis in economics at the Hebrew University. And I worked for Eytan and Lev Hari. I translated a paper that they were doing. I don't know if you remember that, Eytan. It was about learning by doing in diamond industry in Israel.
Of course. Yes, indeed. We had a unique set of data. Israel, of course, had a diamond industry which was created during the Second World War by refugees from Holland, from the Netherlands. And Netanya was the capital of diamonds in Israel, I would say. And we had unique data about the cutting and the polishing and so forth. And in particular, we had even the lifetime experience of the workers in the industry, because the paper was about how much does experience and know-how contribute to the productivity of workers. And we had a unique set of data about the history of the people who worked in this industry. And then we wrote the paper based on that and tried to estimate the influence of experience and know-how in the productivity, as I said. Yes.
And was it large?
Yes, indeed.
Was it large?
Yes, indeed. The learning by doing, a term which was phrased by of course, the doyen of economics, to my mind, Kenneth Arrow, the learning by doing, when he found that his paper about learning by doing was about something interesting, a plant in Sweden that was a mining plant. No investments were made in that plant for years, but the workers stayed and the productivity went up year after year. And there was no additional investment in capital or in new machines or inventions or anything. And eventually Kenneth Arrow came to the idea that the workers became more experienced in what they were doing. And so their productivity was rising in itself. And that's what he called learning by doing. It takes time. And by the way, if I recall now this topic, which is still, of course, relevant, it also, Kenneth Arrow mentioned in his paper, if I'm not mistaken, what I recall, the Liberty ships. You remember during Second World War, there was a real rush to build ships. The US helped the UK by shipping, of course, equipment and arms and so forth to the UK before the US entered the war. And there was a rush of building ships in by new methods, which was they were called the Liberty ships. This was not by galvanizing the plates on the ship, but with nails, if I recall. And Kenneth Arrow mentioned that in the Liberty ships, how over time they measured the productivity of the workers who learned the new technology, and again, measuring the experience and the know-how that was learned on the job, so to speak, and that was the learning by doing. Yes.
Well, Eytan, we'll get back to this, but you may be interested to know that I'm I've been championing apprenticeship for a long time in the United States. We're finally getting some effort, and a big chunk of that is learning by doing, the
Yes,
importance of
wonderful.
learning by doing, work-based learning. But
Yes.
you were an influence on me, you may or may not know, but when I was deciding about grad schools, my advisor at Brandeis told me to go to the student lounges. And the guy at Harvard said, well, it's a nicer part of Cambridge and it's Harvard. And you and George Akerlof
Yes,
convinced me that MIT was the place.
that's
And
right.
I ended up going in large part because you and George convinced me.
Both Eytan and George were students at MIT. at the time.
Classmates, students and
Yes,
classmates.
you were graduate students.
This-
Well, it's really a pleasure that we're going to be talking with you, Eytan, about the arc of your career. Eytan Sheshinski is a professor of economics at Hebrew University for decades and widely published, been a professor at many top American universities over the years, and we'll maybe come to that. But Eytan, let's begin at the beginning. So where did you grow up? What did your parents do? What was the environment in which you grew up?
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Tzvi. I'm very, very, very happy to be here and to be talking to you and to whoever will listen to this program. I grew up I was born in a kibbutz called Ein Harod in the Jezreel Valley. My father came from Germany with his parents from a small town in Germany. My grandfather had a printing shop. And at the time in the 30s, the Germans still allowed, there was a window of opportunity. The Germans wanted the Jews out before the final solution was implemented. And so my grandfather took his shop, the printing shop, and came to Israel with my father as a teenager and established shop in Haifa, Israel, where eventually I grew up. But then my father didn't want to go in the printing business. He actually was a Zionist and wanted to go to a kibbutz. He was a socialist. And so he went to a kibbutz, the kibbutz that was called Ein Harod, one of the oldest and established kibbutzim, the cradle of the kibbutz movement, one of the cradles of kibbutz movement, Ein Harod, in the Jezreel Valley, beautiful valley, which was swamps in the past and then converted into a beautiful valley. And my mother came from Switzerland on her own. She grew up in Zurich, German speaking, and that will be relevant. I'll explain. And grew up in a family. Her mother's maiden name was Blum, and Leon Blum, the Prime Minister of France, the first Jewish Prime Minister of France, 1936 to 1939, an important period of the civil war in Spain. So Leon Blum was from a town called Colmar near Strasbourg in France, in Alsace-Lorraine. And my mother's mother came from that family. It was called Blum. That was her maiden name. And she went to Zurich to work to manage the house of the rabbi of Zurich. My mother, and then she met my grandfather, who came from Lodz and was in the textile business. And so my mother was born in Zurich, grew up in Zurich, and started going to medical school when she finished high school. But she was a Zionist in a Zionist movement. And after 2 years of medical school, she decided to emigrate to Israel by herself, the only one from her family. She had a brother and a sister who did not, and who stayed in Zurich. And when she came to Israel, she said, send me where I'm needed. And they sent her to Ein Harod, where a German group, including my father, German Jews who emigrated, were there, and they thought that she will be integrated easily there, given the German language which she practiced. And that's where they met, and the rest is history. So they married there. I was shown the stall, the cow stall where they were married, and the first night that they were there, the night of the wedding there. Later on, they brought me there to see it. And so they lived in Emigrated, but then after 2 years, my mother, who coming from Zurich, said the kibbutz is not the way she would like to live. And so they moved to Haifa, where my grandfather set up shop. And since then, my father started working for first in the British in a British camp near Haifa. The British were still ruling the country at the time. This was before the War of Independence, and we grew up and I was born born in Emigrated. I was growing up in Haifa. This was my childhood. We were, I would say, we were really poor. I objectively poor. My father didn't have a penny on his soul. And we rented, my parents rented a small room, one room. My bed came out of the wall. There was a folding bed that came out of the wall at night, and at day it was folded back to the wall. And with my parents, there was really no kitchen, just a corridor where my mother was cooking at times. She was not a great cook, I should say. She better be a doctor, but she planned to be and wasn't. And my father started working at the Histadrut, which is the equivalent of the AFL-CIO in Israel, the Histadrut, the workers' union, and became one of the leaders of the Histadrut in the northern part of Israel. That's what he did almost all his life. Later on, and my father moved and became the head of personnel in a fertilizers firm in Haifa, near Haifa. Which is today the chemical plant, ICL, which is Israel Chemical Plant, that was originally a large fertilizer firm with materials from the Dead Sea, which, as you'll see, becomes also relevant for me in my life. So I grew up in Haifa and went there to school. If you want, I can continue to tell you what.
Well, you went through high school there, and then.
That's right.
After high school, what did you do?
Well, it's in high school. I was in a youth movement, which a socialist youth movement. There were a number of what they called sort of kibbutz-oriented leftist movements, and I was in one of them. Although I went to a private school called Hareali in Haifa, I thought that the Boy Scouts, which were the majority of students went there. I went to this movement, and there I met my wife, and we are in 2 weeks. We'll celebrate 62 years. Our anniversary will be the 62nd anniversary, and I met my wife in the youth movement. So I went to, and then in the army. And that's a little relevant to later on to what Zvi was saying, 68. I'll come back to that. We went to a kibbutz and then to the army, which was at that time there was a unit called Nachal, which was translated pioneer, fighting pioneer unit, a rather elite unit, I would say at the time for sure, and afterwards to the paratroopers for advanced training. And so I was in the paratrooper training. And,
what year did you enter the army?
55, I believe, if I remember, or 54, and then yes, and during the army, as I said, we were in the paratroopers later on, and this is relevant because Zvi mentioned that I sent him to the US in 1968. In 1967, I'm jumping forward, but we'll come back to
go ahead.
After the army. But I was at MIT. Then let me go chronologically. So I after the army, Ruti and I decided to study at the Hebrew University. My wife studied physics and mathematics, and I decided I will study economics and statistics, and I started studying, I think, in 1958, and it was, and I must say, I thought what I thought is economics is about was definitely not what I found. My ideas all came from the youth movement, from Marxism, Karl Marx. We studied Das Kapital and Engels and so forth. And I thought this is about exploitation and the surplus value and all these terms that at the time for Marxist theory. When I came, my teacher was Don Patinkin, who came from Chicago, and he brought modern economics into Israel. Previously, there were some Germanic professors at the Hebrew who taught economics, but he brought modern economics to, and when I came, he already taught introductory economics and then price theory, some other teachers which he trained. And so I went to study economics, and I found it's exciting. I thought I'll find something, one thing, and I found much more exciting. Patinkin was drawing a transformation curve between butter and guns, and so forth, talking about marginal productivity and transformation curve. And so I thought, this is wonderful. This is more mathematical and more precise than I ever thought it is, and so forth. Anyway, I went on and was really taken by it. At the first year in economics at that time, the method was they accepted many for the first year, and then after the first year there was a selection, so to speak, an exam which reduced the number of students, if I recall, from something like 500 or 600 to 150 or so.
Wow.
This was an exam, a selection exam. So they thought that this is the most predictive, which I think it was at the time. This was the better than high school matriculation grades at the time, and it was. So in the first year exam, in this selection exam, I got 100, and I thought, well, it seems to be going well, so here I am. But the point where I decided that I will be really an academic economist came in the second year. In the second year, which was called price theory, microeconomic theory, it was taught by, I went to a class taught by Nissan Leviathan, a wonderful teacher, and participated in the War of Independence in the Palmach, really one of my heroes. And after the first term on Hanukkah, about Christmas time, there is an exam. And during that exam, this was an American type exam, I remember, with answers, and you had to answer a quiz, what we call the quiz, an American type exam. And I knew, looking at the exam, I knew what they expect the answer is, but then the diagram, I won't go into details, but there was a diagram, particular diagram, which suggested maybe there is an exception here. And I answered a different answer. And then the next week, when Leviathan came to class and gave the answers to the exam, I raised my hand, and the 150, 200 students sitting there, and I said, I think you're mistaken. Wow, the class was absolutely quiet. You could hear a needle falling. And so Leviathan said, well, here, come to the blackboard and show me where I'm wrong. And I went to the blackboard. I won't go into the technical thing. Svi and you will understand. This was something about some non-negativity condition about the substitution term in demand. And so I explained why I answered a different answer than they expected. And Leviathan said, I think I have to think about that. And that was the moment I decided, well, if Leviathan has to think about my answer, I'm in the right place. That was the moment, definite moment I decided that's my life.
And then how did you end up at MIT for grad school?
Yes. This comes back to Patinkin, because At that time, he was decided everything. And when I finished, well, it was good, very good grades, I may say. And I decided that for PhD, I will go to the US. And Patinkin took me to discuss with me the issue. I told him I want to go to the US. He wanted very much students to stay there to develop the master's degree and so forth. But I thought this will take years. I don't have the time. By the way, I should say also parenthetically that I finished my bachelor's degree in 2 instead of 3 years. I was in a hurry, and my wife will tell you about that because we were already we call it friends or lovers for 6 years, and she said we have to get married. That's it. And I said I don't have the time. I have to finish it in 2 years. And so eventually we agreed that we'll devote one afternoon to the marriage, and that's it. I'll go back to study, and that's what we did. But back to the story, that I went to Patinkin for a discussion, and he said, okay, well, you want to go to Chicago and study labor economics. And then I'll promise you'll have a job at the Hebrew University. I said, let me think about it. I knew about, at that time, I was reading the foundation, Samuelson's foundation. And I knew about Bob Solow and about the others. And that's a story in itself, how Samuelson was rejected from Harvard, was not accepted to the Harvard department, which was recognized by Ed Mason as the worst mistake that Harvard made in its history, the department. And Samuelson established the department at MIT. And then he brought Bob Solow a year later. And having read them, those two, I thought that's the place to go. This is the place, and not Chicago. And I remember on the crucial date at that time, you sent telegrams to answer. I was standing in the main post office in Israel to send the telegram to the school. I was accepted to all the schools I applied to. It was Berkeley, Princeton, Harvard, and MIT, and Yale, and so forth. And I was calling Patinkin on the phone and told him I decided to go to MIT. And he said, well, you know that you are on your own now. That's fine. God bless you, but you're on your own. There's no promise about the job when you come back. Okay, that's when I decided to go to MIT, which I described as the second most important decision I made in my life after marriage to Ruthie. And this was a wonderful, absolutely wonderful period at MIT. Some people call those 60s, when I came in 1963, the golden age at MIT. The class you already mentioned, George Akerlof, there was Joe Stiglitz and Bill Nordhaus and so others. You see, they all got the Nobel. So here was me, poor little me, the farmer from the Middle East, and it was them. It was a wonderful period. Wonderful.
And Peter Diamond, Peter
Diamond was 2 years ahead of me. He was already at Berkeley at that time, having finished his PhD. And I'll tell you that I looked at his PhD when I started writing my PhD, and I said, okay, how long should it be? They said, look at Peter Diamond. It was 50 plus pages or so, very short. But of course, it was top notch, and I knew that this is the guy. And since then, I was in touch.
Peter Diamond came back
to MIT from Berkeley. His first job was
just
Berkeley.
as I was starting, and
exactly.
He co-taught with E. Carey Brown.
That's right.
Carey Brown,
a wonderful person,
and it was Peter Diamond. It was Peter Diamond and Eytan Sheshinski who convinced me in 1970 to go to MIT. Indeed.
So,
we have a story about that, and we did interview Tzvi, Eytan. So Tzvi's whole life career is already on record with us.
Yes. Let me just jump, Robert. Let me just say one word, because Tzvi mentioned in 1968. I came back to the Hebrew. I got a job at Harvard at the time after my PhD. I wanted to stay for a year or two. and I got a contract for 5 years, as usual, for assistant professors. And then in June 1967, I went to the first conference in my life. It was in Lake Como in northern Italy, about growth. My dissertation was about growth. Perhaps we'll talk more about that. But we knew already that there is some tension in the Middle East. Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, closed the Straits of Tiran, going to Eilat, and Israel said that this is a casus belli, this is a war, and will not tolerate that kind of closure. And so when I went to this conference in Como, in Lake Como, I knew that there's some chance of hostilities and war. And then on the 4th of June, actually, as 1967, we were on the lake with some great economists, Herbert Scarf and others I remember, and they announced the war started. And I asked the boat to take me back to the town, to Como. A good friend, Giorgio Lamalfa, who was later a senator in Italy and was a great guy by himself, and took me with his sports car to Milan. But I found out, of course, there were no flights to Israel. I went to Rome that day. I called Ruti, of course, to ask permission to go to Israel, and I came to Rome and came to the embassy. And you may recall, you guys, that on the first day of the 6-day war, Israel was quiet. The news, Israel didn't say anything. And only the Arab media was full with news that Israel, an Arab convoy, an Egyptian convoy is close to Tel Aviv. Haifa is in flames and so forth. It was awful, awful. It looked unbelievable to me that after a period of preparation, Israel was caught with its pants down. But when I came to the embassy in Rome, they said, everything is fine, everything is wonderful. We destroyed the Arab Air Force, and so the Arab Air Forces and so forth. But still, I couldn't go to Israel. There were no civil flights. And so my uncle in Zurich at that time, who was the economic attaché in Switzerland, and he said, tomorrow there's a chartered plane for the media who goes to Israel. So I took a plane from Rome to Zurich, and I was on that plane, on the charter plane. So I came to the 6-day war on the second day of the war. I couldn't join my unit in the regular way because after 4 years away from Israel or 5 years away, they put you in a pool and then reallocate you. I knew that this, I will never reach a unit at that time. This is not the way things are in Israel. So I called up and found out my unit is in Jerusalem. And to cut things short, I was with the paratroopers in Jerusalem when Jerusalem was captured. This was 1967. And at the end of that summer, going back to Boston, my wife and I decided, I broke up my contract at Harvard and decided to move back to Israel at that time, that summer. That was the story.
And at that
So
point, Hebrew, you was able to grab this young Harvard professor to join Hebrew University. And you were teaching, what field were you going to be teaching at Harvard?
I started teaching right away the microeconomics course. I never taught the introductory economics, the microeconomics course, which is second year, the major course for second year bachelor's. And I actually wrote a book. At that time, there were student books, a publishing house at the Hebrew University, which you may have studied from. It's called Price Theory. From those lectures, I wrote that booklet. And later on, I wrote also a booklet on, which was called Public Finance, 2 books as a teacher. And I started teaching at the Hebrew University, and I enjoyed it. And it was wonderful.
And I have to say, I took Eytan's price theory course, and I argued with him about how the kibbutz system was actually superior to
Indeed. I remember that, Tzvi.
Because
I'm not sure you still think
I
so.
had come from a kibbutz, yeah.
Yes, I remember that, Tzvi. You were a Shomer HaTzair,
That's right.
Of course, I remember that very well, Tzvi. This was a
But-
very
But
unusual.
even though I only spent a few years in Israel, my rights go further back because my great uncle started Degania Aleph, the first kibbutz.
Oh,
uh,
really?
Yosef Bussel.
Yeah, Joseph Bussel. That's a legendary
used to-
figure.
He was my grandmother's brother. So
Oh, a legendary
anyway,
figure. Chayuta and Yosef Bigo. Chayuta was his wife. So you remember that
Yeah.
history? My memory is still functioning. So Chayuta and Yosef Bussel were.
So-
yeah.
let's talk a little bit about your economics career, your kind of topics that you were studying, what you were focused on, how that evolved, and then later we'll come to your activities with working with direct public policies and governments.
Yes.
But
yes,
let's start
thank
with your
you.
economics itself.
Yes, yes. So as I already alluded to, my dissertation was, as it was at that time at MIT, was about growth theory. And in fact, one of the chapters was about learning by doing, with some optimization, which Arrow has not done in his original paper. It was an extension of Arrow, and also, of course, using the model that was the Solow model, which is the working horse of applied theory, was at that time, probably is to some extent still today. And so my dissertation was on growth theory, embodied, disembodied technical change, learning by doing, and so forth. It was a good dissertation. I thought that I will continue, but then I starting to collaborate to see what Peter Diamond is doing, and I thought that he was moving into what was called public finance and some issues of applied theory. And I thought that, yeah, there's some signs of decreasing margin returns to growth theory. And this seems very interesting, and major issues, of course, of taxation, of social security, and so forth. And maybe this is a place where you can combine fruitfully theory and applications. And I never did much empirical work, but theory which can be applied and used and data used. So I moved, as I came to Israel, I slowly moved into public finance. And as I already told you, I wrote, I taught it. I started teaching it at the Hebrew University. I think it was at that time quite an innovative course in terms of content. Optimal taxation. Now it's all standard stuff for students, but that time it was very new, innovative. Optimal taxation, public goods, social security, optimal retirement, and so forth and so on. This was, so I taught public finance and started working on it, and wrote papers on it, and on taxation, on public goods, and some collaborating with Joe Stiglitz on the public goods paper, and with others. And so anyway, I think I regard myself as an applied theory guy who worked mainly, whose focus was mainly in, I don't think I would call it now public finance. You see, the word public finance is the old word, which was coined by Richard Musgrave and others, of emphasizing the finance part. But then an economist called Leif Johansen, who was, by the way, a Norwegian communist, Leif Johansen, but a Western economist style, who wrote a book. It's a story in itself. He wanted to come to MIT, and the US didn't give him a visa. Leif Johansen wrote a book called Public Economics. So anyway, that's the word, that's the name that is today adopted, public economics, putting equal weight on the expenditure side and on the finance part. And and that's what I did. I taught public economics at the Hebrew University for 50 years.
You brought Peter Diamond to Israel on.
Yes, I
several-
brought, indeed, Peter Diamond. There were several conferences which we did in Israel. I think it was a very good group on those topics, on applied theory, which was one of the leading groups in the world, I would say. And it's not it's not something which you can say lightly. For a small
Yeah.
country like Israel to have a group that is world renowned is not something standard. And it worked, and
And
still is.
that's exactly when I did my master's degree. From
Yes.
1968 to 1970,
Right,
heyday.
right.
Well,
And-
I recall, I believe that there was either 1975 or 76, a major international public economics conference
Yes,
in
indeed.
Israel.
In Kiryat
At
kibbutz,
the
yes.
Moshav, I believe, or
A kibbutz near Tel Aviv, near Jerusalem, called
kibbutz, yeah,
Kiryat Anavim.
Kiryat Anavim, and that at that conference was the first time that Kahneman and Tversky gave a wonderful paper.
I see.
I thought it was very interesting at the time, and
Yes.
these are
yes.
the people that got behavioral economics going.
Indeed,
But,
Amos
yeah.
Tversky, if I may, Amos Tversky was a childhood friend of Ruti and me. He went to the
Oh,
same
really?
high school in Haifa. Amos Tversky, and was for all his life. We were very close friends. Yes.
Well, yeah. So it's now.
And Kahneman is also a friend of you.
Excuse me.
Kahneman is also a friend of you.
Of course, Danny Kahneman. Yeah. Although Kahneman had a different history, he was in France, growing up in France a little part of his life. But Amos was really in the midst of one of the boys, quote. Same youth movement as we went to, in the left. His mother was a Knesset member for a while, Zhenya Tversky. And you see, my memory still stretches to that time. Anyway, and we were close friends.
So tell us, among the many papers that you wrote, what papers give you a real good feeling about some of the work that you did?
I think
Is there one or two? Are there one or two that?
No, perhaps I think the early papers on public economics and on optimal taxation and an econometrica paper with Joe Stiglitz on public goods and some neutrality theorems I'm proud of. But then I moved on to do later on in life some on inflation and cost of price adjustment, on behavior of firms when price changes are costly, like changing the menu.
Yes.
It was called, I think we invented that. It was sort of a field, or I would say,
became very
a line of studies in economics started studying menu cost, which meant that changing prices, both vis-a-vis information dissemination and by changing the menu. Example is, of course, the simplest one. You cannot, when you change prices, a menu, you better change all the prices at the same time. There's some cost to changing it. And dissemination of information, that inflation is changing prices. This is the cost of inflation, namely, what is the optimal policy of a firm to keep nominal prices intact for a while and then changing it to a new level because the price level was rising during inflation periods. And we, I would say, wrote some of the fundamental papers, so-called the SS pricing, on adjustment, firms adjusting periodically the prices and what is the optimal policy and what does it do to the amplitude and to the frequency of cycles and so forth. So I'm very proud of that trend and of those papers. And I'll mention then, I'll jump ahead and say one of my latest papers, more on choice, on behavioral. I thought that let me say this is a paper on that people make mistakes when they don't choose the same item even under similar circumstances. They make mistakes, and the mistakes are exacerbated by the number of options or of other products that they have. The more products you have, it exacerbates the mistakes. And so I developed a model, a logistic model, which I won't go into now, because it raises then the question, what is the best, how many options should you provide individual, knowing that giving many options, people tend to make mistake, it exacerbates mistake. So you have the tension between heterogeneity of tastes. People have different tastes. And if you eliminate some options that will hurt some people, like health insurance, some families are with many children, some without, and so on. You have to adapt. What is the menu, so to speak, of products that you should provide families, knowing that sometimes you shouldn't provide, that the maximum number of options is not always the optimal one, because you exacerbate mistakes. I think this is an important line.
That's a great, yeah, very
Yes.
interesting. Well, let's turn a little bit to your work with the government and public
Yes.
policy. How did you get into that? Did you start early with that? And I mean,
Well,
you're in
I
Jerusalem
advised-
where the Knesset is. And
Yes, I advised the Knesset and on public policy for a while, but really the jump into applied into policy making came in 2010. Israel, around the year 2000, relatively large discoveries of gas fields, offshore gas fields were found in the economic waters of Israel. What the economic waters is where a country has still sovereignty over the waters for searching and for extracting minerals like gas and oil. And the U.S. Geological Survey already predicted that this will be, the Eastern Mediterranean is promising in terms of gas and oil offshore. And indeed, around the year 2000, they found a relatively small well with about 20 billion cubic meters. That's the way they measure it, of gas off the shores of Ashkelon. And then later on, Tamar, which was 250 billion cubic meters, and eventually Leviathan, 600 or so cubic meters. So Israel has to date about a trillion cubic meters, while Israel itself is consuming only about 20 billion. So we are a potentially large exporter of gas. I may say a word about that. But then in 2010, the question was how to provide, what is the method you provide private concessionaires the exclusive right to extract gas? How do you do it? In the US, it's done by auction. You want to extract oil from the Bay of Mexico, from the Gulf of Mexico. There's an auction, and everybody and the one who gets the highest bid is paying the government what is called a signature bonus. And that's it. And you have exclusive right for, let's say, 40 square miles or so in the Gulf of Mexico. Israel did everything wrong, in the sense, giving it to private interests and to private contractors was, of course, the right way. Government is really not good in doing those kind of things. But they gave it more or less free, without pricing those gas fields. And so then around the year 2010 or so, when they started extracting the gas and dollars started flowing into Israel, the government said, gee, are we getting our fair share in the revenue of those gas fields? And they established a committee. The Minister of Finance at that time, Yuval Steinitz, appointed a committee, and I was chairing that committee, which in the popular press is called the Sheshinski number 1. The numbers will be clear in a minute. And I was chairing a committee of 5, and we sat on that for 2 years on what is the appropriate share of a government when private investors have risked their private capital. Of course, it was risky, but it was unknown, but where the finding will be. But after so the period of exploration has large risks, but then after the production is done, you have the usual risks of an industry. And we established we had recommendations that what the government should get in terms of excess profits. That's called excess profits, above normal profits. The above normal is created because they were getting it free. And so they haven't paid for all their input. And there was a tremendous campaign from the moment my committee was established, the Sheshinski committee was established, a tremendous campaign by the franchisees, mainly an Israeli company called Delek, headed by a man called Tshuva, and then in collaboration with an American company whose headquarters were in Houston, Texas, and they Noble Energy, and a tremendous campaign, unprecedented in Israel, started against me and also me personally, and even my family, and against that. And I remember that period, those 2 years, still in my study. If you could see in my studies, I have hanging all and I have a collection of all the publications in the press about Sheshinski, who's a communist and exploiting, and so forth. Anyway, for 2 years, I should say though, I worked for the government. I asked the Minister of Finance not to pay me. I would like to work pro bono, they say, because I thought it will give me strength. When I come with the recommendation, it was not for money, it was not for any pay. And so I worked for pro bono for 2 years. We recommended a certain method of taxation on excess profits, which will make the government take, as it's called, from that source to about 60% of the pure profit, as was the average for the OECD countries. And then after a fierce fight in Parliament, in the Knesset, the law was adopted. And that's what they call the Sheshinski 1 law of excess profits. I thought that this was a culmination of what I did in the public sector, and I'm still proud of it today. Established, among other things, the sovereign fund, which for the money was put not in the regular budget, but in a sovereign fund, which has started to work last year. And unlike the Norwegian fund, the largest in the world sovereign funds in that field of oil and gas is
we call it sovereign wealth fund.
Sovereign wealth fund. And so the largest are the Qatar, and Norway, and Israel will not be on that range. They have about $1 trillion each one, more than $1 trillion assets each one, but Israel is much smaller. But still, it's a significant in term for Israel, 2% of GDP, and it will be used for long term. And if we'll come to it and we'll have time, I'll tell you my ideas what it should be done today with the assets of that sovereign wealth fund. And
why don't you tell us now?
okay, I'll just finish that and say why Sheshinski 1, because then 2 years later, as you say in the US, no good deed goes unpunished. So after I published that report and it was passed as a law in the Knesset, a new Minister of Finance called Yair Lapid, who is now the Prime Minister of Israel, it was at that time Minister of Finance, called me up and said, how about having now a law about taxation of the minerals from the Dead Sea, which is specifically the major one is potash, unique in the world in terms of the cheap way that they dig the potash from the Dead Sea, just by scraping it, basically, not having to dig into in the mountains or so, as other countries in Ethiopia and Belarus and so forth are doing. So why don't you, and so a new committee was established, and I'll cut short and tell you that the solution was somewhat different, but also in principle the same as we had before about taxation of excess profits, giving the entrepreneurs a fair return on their investment. And this was then eventually Sheshinski 2. At that time, already Netanyahu was the prime minister. He didn't like our report, and for reasons which he may explain when time comes, if he wishes. But the Knesset nevertheless approved it. It was very unusual for the Knesset that the coalition and the opposition combined
Came
forces
together
to vote in favor. And so the second law was passed, and that's in the books now. So Sheshinski 1 and 2 are in the books about taxation of
And you got no
minerals.
commission, huh?
And I wrote pro bono for 5 years, I would say, and I'm very proud. I would say between us, nobody listens to us, yes. I'll tell you, I'm very proud about that.
If you
Yes,
if you had gotten only 1/2 of 1%.
Yeah, right. You see, this is exactly what Shuva said, that the owner of the Della company, the franchisee of the first big in Israel, he told me all the time, listen, we don't need a committee or report. We can come to a deal. It's easy to find Allah and so forth. So perhaps I made a mistake. I wouldn't have been a
You
retired
did
poor
not make a
professor.
mistake. Eytan.
Excuse me, Tzvi.
You did not make a mistake. Your reward will come in the next world.
Well, if you say so, I'll report to you, Tzvi, when I come there, and I'll see.
Okay.
I think I should be.
We'll meet someday.
When we all get there.
I thought they should greet me fairly when I come up there and say you did a good thing. Yes.
Right.
So you were saying you have some ideas about what they should do now.
Yes. Let me
Is that
say
with
it
the
briefly.
fund or with pricing?
With the fund, with the revenue from the
there's-
fund? With
Yeah,
revenue
the
from
sovereign
the
wealth.
fund. Yes, the
One
fund.
thing that I would say that, probably a normal Israeli is saying, well, we got all this gas, but we have these super high taxes on still
Yes.
on
Yes.
petrol and.
Of course they say,
how
but
can
you
that
know,
be?
Israelis will complain anyway. So you have to discount the standard. The standard is, Israel is full with grumbling and discontent. But that fund for long term, the original goal, which was, and I got really strong support from Stanley Fischer, was at that time the Chancellor of the Bank of Israel, was for the Dutch disease. What do I mean? What is the Dutch disease? In the 60s, in the 20th century, in the 60s, when the oil in the North Sea was discovered, dollars started flowing into countries like the Netherlands and Norway and so forth. And then this revaluated the currency. And so traditional export industries were hurt badly by this inflow of dollars, of foreign exchange, and the economy started going into recession. This is called the Dutch disease. The inflow of foreign currency who comes in from those resources. And so the idea was to establish a sovereign wealth fund which will invest its money overseas or abroad, the US, worldwide, diversify, and stretch it over longer periods so future generations can also enjoy that as well. And this was the major reason.
And then it won't
it's
have
still-
that big of an effect on the currency.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Mitigate the flow, smooth it over time. This was the idea, and at the time, and it still, to some extent, is a good reason to hold a sovereign fund invested overseas to diversify risk and to stretch it into a longer period than the revenues are coming in, because eventually in Israel the estimate is after 30 or 35 or 40 years, depending on the how much you extract, this will end up. These are exhaustible resources. So this is the idea, to smooth the revenue over longer periods. I think today, given global warming problem, I think the Dutch disease is secondary in importance, and the Bank of Israel knows how to handle the exchange rate value and so forth. And I think it's less of importance to Israel. Much more important is that Israel should go into honestly into the climate, into mitigation of global warming, and to devote a large part of the sovereign fund to new energies, solar energies, and perhaps other types. We can talk about that. I'm talking about hydroelectric and nuclear plants, which the US is also starting thinking. And again, in Israel, by the way, parenthetically, I'll say, thinking about nuclear power plants has other aspects which have to be considered, security aspects, because once Israel will have nuclear power plants, electricity power plants, other countries in the region will also, of course, demand it and will have it eventually. And so we better think about it strategically, about nuclear. But coming back, new energies, clean energies, and in other words, enlisting the sovereign wealth fund to climate change is what I would today, if they would ask my opinion, and perhaps they will, and perhaps I will also write about that, I think is an appropriate goal for Israel's sovereign wealth fund.
Well, Bob Pindyck, who I assume
yes.
you know well, and
Very well. Very
and I
well.
are friendly with. He has a book where he emphasizes the importance of mitigation, of
Adaptation.
another word, adaptation, and
yes.
that's a big thing in his book.
Yes, let me just say, I'll just tell you, you mentioned Bob Pindyck. He was one of the experts which I called into Israel when my committee was was working, to give us an estimate what is the normal profit that the diversified investor requires in the, for example, in the mineral, in the potash industry and so forth. And he was the one, together with the International Monetary Fund, gave us expert opinion on that, and he helped us very much, and I'm grateful to the contribution that Bob Pindyck made to Israel as well.
Very good. Tzvi, we're nearing the hour here, and maybe you'd like to ask if
my question is a personal one. Eytan and Ruti have a number of daughters.
Four
of them, and two of them live in Israel, and the last I heard, two of them live in the States, right?
Indeed, Tzvi, indeed, yes.
So for a while, I know you were teaching at Brown half the time so that you could spend your time among the grandchildren, and I'm what you're doing now.
Well, thank you for the question. Indeed, my daughters, I'm very proud of what they're doing, and two of them are in Israel. One at the Bank of Israel is head of one of these departments there, the clearing department, and another one works in a government company, is the CEO of that company. And my two daughters in the US are one is in Boston, was a professor at Bet Israel. She's a surgeon and was in Bet Israel. She actually recently left Bet Israel, retired from Bet Israel. She was a professor at the Harvard Medical School, and she retired and started and works now as second in line in a startup, a medical startup, which we won't go into, but a very courageous move, I thought, and risky, and I'm still worrying, but anyway, she's very happy, and that's what she's doing today. And then I have a daughter at Stanford, a biochemist who worked at Stanford for all these years. Her husband is a professor in the business school there, and she was in the medical school in a lab, a biochemical lab. And she also left Stanford recently and started in a startup about data storage in the cloud, in a cloud storage. I won't go into details, but she's also happy. And I worry about the risks involved in startups and so forth. 8 out of 10 are not making it, but here they are in their life in the prime time, and they took risks. And anyway, I'm very proud of them.
Well, your ancestors took risks. Israel was a startup itself. Indeed,
yes. And we haven't mentioned my own risk attempts at climbing mountains, which I suffered from with some falls. And I'm still, you should know, Bob, that in Israel, there's a unit named numbered 669. That unit is a unit for rescuing pilots whose plane falls behind enemy lines. But they rescue also some people when there are floods and other things. And I am still the champion of that unit. Why? Because I went with Israel Aumann to climb, to do snappling in the Judean desert. And twice we were rescued by that unit because we couldn't get back on. So they pulled us up to the helicopters and pulled us out. I hold the record of 3 times being rescued by the 669 unit. And this is in a book which appeared a year ago, I think, about that unit. And some pages are devoted to us. And they know, I told them last time, when we'll go again, if it ever happens, for snappling and the Judean desert, I'll let them know ahead of time so they can be on alert.
So are you able to get over to the United States? We had
Look,
COVID.
yeah, okay, this is let me be very honest about this and open. For the last 3 years, my wife, Ruth, my beloved wife, has dementia. And so, of course, there was also the corona. But because of her situation, I did not go to the US for the last several years, and I am devoting much of my time today to support her. We have a Philippine live-in. It works rather well. We manage, but that's the situation. Sometimes, those are the cards that you are dealt with.
Yeah.
And I felt that this is my obligation, and I do it gladly. And that's what I do. But I will go to the US again soon in the summer. I'll certainly be there.
I assume that the girls and the grandchildren come to visit.
Of course, they did. Passover, we always are in Israel. Passover, all of them are in Israel. We're 24 people in Israel, my grandchildren, and so my daughters. And we celebrate Passover as well. I hope we'll do the next Passover and the holidays. In a few weeks, my daughters will come to Israel again to visit us. So we see them indeed quite a bit. And some of my grandchildren, the 2 from Boston, by the way, are already in the Israeli army. They came for a year and decided to stay for the time being. We'll see what transpires with them.
Well,
so anyway,
I hope
very
to
happy.
visit you. I hope to visit you myself. My
Wonderful, Bob.
older daughter lives on Chovevei Zion Street.
Oh, well, here you are, walking distance from me. Wonderful.
And we'll have to renew old acquaintances. But I think for now, we may have exhausted our listeners.
Thank you. Indeed.
It's been very
I'm sorry,
interesting
I
to hear
apologize.
no, not at all, to hear about your career. And Zvi has a very good way that we complete all of our interviews.
Yes, we say sei gesund.
Thank you.
Sei gesund.
Sei gesund. Sei gesund, my 2 friends.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.